Hello, I'm back once again. My name is High Priestess Tana, coming from Tana Temple Healing Words, and I want to continue part 4 of this video because it abruptly cut off while I was in the middle of trying to finish this thing up here. But yeah, so basically, slavery was as much as the part of the history of Detroit as the fur trade. So, most residents who could afford slaves owned them during Detroit's French, British, and early American periods, from the city's founding in 1701 to the second decade of the 19th century. In 1750, for example, toward the end of the French regime, more than 25% of Detroit residents kept slaves. That's a quarter of the city. That's a lot. And like I said, although the amount of slaves, the actual amount that was in the city at the time was not as high or as high of a significant number or whatever like it was in the South, in the southern states or territories at the time, because they weren't called states yet. They were like still like colonies or territories from my understanding, but now they're recognized as states and they've been recognized as such for the past few centuries. But yeah. So it says, not surprisingly, Detroit's slave owners came from the wealthiest segment of French society and produced a disproportionate amount of the village's grain and livestock. And it says, writes Brent Rushforth in Bonds of Alliance, a new book about slavery in Quebec and the Great Lakes area in the 17th and 18th centuries. Wow. Rushforth's book touches upon the subject of slavery in Detroit, and in so doing, he helps raise the veil on the city's hidden history. Another academic, the University of Michigan's Tia Miles, yes, I've got a lot of my information I'm talking about now from Tia Miles and then Bill McGraw, but most of this information I received, or I wouldn't say received, but that I've retrieved actually came from Tia Miles doing her research. Okay, has begun researching the subject, and earlier this year she told NPR's was it Michelle Martin that slavery had a multi-layered aspect in Detroit. That's a unique way of putting it. There are almost no physical reminders of slavery left in Detroit. But one artifact that remains is a scarred and cracked account book that has yellow and brittle pages. It sits in storage in the Burton Historical Collection at the Detroit Public Library. The book belonged to William Macomb, the richest person in Detroit when he died in 1796. Don't that sound familiar? Macomb County. See what I'm talking about? Macomb owned Grosse Ile and Belle Isle. Belle Isle. Oh my God. I need to make a separate video on that too. Between the race riots and Belle Isle. Oh my goodness. And several houses in page after page of livestock, tools, and furniture. Macomb also owned people. Heard that? Listed predominantly near the front of the book, along with things like shovel tongs, saddlebags, and goats, are the names of or references to 26 human beings. Scipio, don't these names sound familiar? Tom, Guy, Charlie, and let's see, only one, Jim Gertie, had a family name. Together, the slaves' total was listed as 1,655 pounds in New York currency. In his will, Macomb wrote, "I give and bequeath, to my loving wife, Mrs. Sarah Macomb, for her own use, all my movable estate, wheresoever my slaves." The nerve! Talk about my movable estate. Fuck out of here. My slaves, cattle, household furniture, books, plates, linen carriages, and my utensils of husbandry. I examined that book last week with the librarian and photographer. It is stark. We acknowledge that it felt strange to look at a simple page with lovely penmanship that represents a national horror, like I mentioned before, involving so much human suffering. Whew. Detroit's history of slavery is complicated by the fact that African Americans were not the only people held in captivity. I said that in part one. Native Americans were also enslaved here, especially during the early decades of the 18th century when the French ran Detroit. Indian slavery predated the arrival of Europeans, and it was a very different system than the form of black slavery that Europeans brought to North America. Heard that? Indians did not consider slaves property, and in native cultures, slaves possessed symbolic value and were used as gifts during trade and negotiations and to take the place of dead warriors. Eventually, though, Indian slavery mixed with European slavery and produced a hybrid form of bondage that played a major role in relations among Indians and Europeans in Detroit throughout the 18th century. Slavery was important, for example, in the interaction between men and women. Traders in Detroit's early days used female Indian slaves as backcountry wives. What? Both for companionship and as a way to ingratiate themselves with the woman's relatives, which enhanced the traders' ability to do business with the Indians. During the British era, one of Detroit's most successful traders was John Askin. I believe that I touched base on him. We'll touch briefly on his background, I believe in part one, who had 3 children with an Ottawa woman named Monette, a slave he owned and later freed. Askin was known for his aggressive business tactics, including plying Indians with alcohol. What? His papers, also preserved at the Burton Collection, show he bought and sold several native and black slaves during his his career. Why was I about to say era? Rum and sex paved the way for Askin's success, wrote historian E.A.S. Dimmers. Okay. Sexual violence permeated the slave experience in the Great Lakes, wrote Rushforth. Many women, he added, like Monette, eventually rose to social acceptance and freedom, but not before a prolonged submission to what could be defined as serial, I'm going to say RAPE. Whether male or female, life was harsh for slaves on the Detroit frontier. They generally slept on the kitchen floors of Detroiters' homes. I mentioned this in part one. And the record is clear that owners did not hesitate to flog their human property. That's what I'm saying. They were under the same conditions as chattel slavery in the South. Like I said before, just because the amount of slaves wasn't as high in the amounts as it was in the South doesn't mean that this should be overshadowed or minimized or undermined it by any way, shape, form, or circumstances. Oh boy, this is crazy. Oh my God. It says, and the record is clear that owners did not hesitate to flog their human property when they believed discipline was called for. Yet in slavery scale, Detroit was not South Carolina. I just mentioned that. Detroit's simple trade and economy, small population and modest farms did not require large number of slaves. And slaves in Detroit generally lived in closer proximity to their owners than slaves in the South. Slaves never exceeded 10% of the population in Detroit. In the South, before the Civil War, slaves made up 33% of the population. Damn. In Detroit, Macomb was the biggest slave owner with a couple of dozen slaves. In Virginia, Thomas Jefferson owned 600 slaves in his lifetime. Jorge Castellanos, a former professor at Marygrove College, once wrote that Detroit was not a slave society, but a society with slaves. What? Let me read that again. Jorge Castellanos, a former professor at Marygrove College, once wrote that Detroit was not a slave society, but a society with slaves. Oh boy. Gross ill. once owned by William Macomb, is the largest island in the Detroit River. Heard that? Residents have done a lot to keep alive